They found him on day 801, chained to a stone pillar in the deepest cavern of Iron Canyon, his body barely recognizable as human. What Marshal Wade Thompson discovered that morning would haunt him until his dying breath. But to understand the horror of those 800 days, we must go back to where it all began, to a single bullet, fired in panic, that shattered two worlds forever. The sun hung like a copper coin over Salvation Ridge, New Mexico territory, in the summer of 1877. The town was nothing more than a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the edge of civilization, where the last traces of law dissolved into the wild expanses of Apache territory. This was a place where men came to disappear, to reinvent themselves, or to die quietly away from the judgment of civilized society. Jacob Mercer wasn't running from anything. At least that's what he told himself. At 26 years old, he'd come west with dreams of striking silver in the mountains, like so many young men before him. With his sandy hair, quick smile, and Eastern manners, he stood out among the hardened prospectors and drifters who called Salvation Ridge home. He'd been in town only 3 months, working a small claim in the hills with moderate success, sending money back to his mother in Philadelphia, writing letters about the magnificent sunsets and the promise of opportunity. On that particular August morning, Jacob rode into the hills earlier than usual, hoping to beat the crushing afternoon heat. His mule, a stubborn beast named Bartholomew, carried his mining equipment along a narrow trail that wound through scrub pine and red rock formations. The air smelled of sage and dust, and the only sounds were the rhythmic clop of hooves and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Jacob had been warned about the territories to the north and west of his claim. That's where the Chiricahua hold their ground, old Tom Brennan had told him at the saloon. Chief Nantaje's people. They've got a treaty with the army, but that don't mean they take kindly to white men poking around their sacred places. You stay south of the red marker stones, boy, or you'll end up as buzzard food. But Jacob wasn't thinking about warnings that morning. He was thinking about the promising vein of silver he'd spotted the previous week, just a bit further north than he usually ventured. It couldn't hurt to take a look, he reasoned. He wasn't planning to mine there, just to explore, to see if his hunch about the geological formations was correct. It was this curiosity, this seemingly innocent decision to venture just a little beyond the boundary, that would seal his fate. The sun climbed higher as Jacob worked his way into unfamiliar territory. The landscape grew more rugged, with towering rock formations casting long shadows across narrow canyons. He should have turned back when he crossed the line of red stones, ancient markers placed generations ago to delineate tribal lands. But the prospector's fever had him in its grip, and he pressed on, leading Bartholomew deeper into the maze of stone. He was examining an outcropping of quartz-streaked rock when he heard it, the soft sound of footsteps on stone. Jacob spun around, his hand instinctively dropping to the old Colt revolver on his hip. His heart hammered in his chest as a figure emerged from behind a boulder. It was a young Apache man, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, with long black hair and traditional dress. He carried a rifle, but it was slung across his back. His hands were empty, held slightly away from his body in what might have been a peaceful gesture. For a moment, the two young men simply stared at each other, frozen in that crystalline instant before everything fell apart. The Apache spoke in his native tongue, words that Jacob couldn't understand. The tone wasn't threatening. If anything, it sounded almost curious, perhaps even warning. But Jacob, his nerves already frayed from the isolation and the constant stories of violence on the frontier, interpreted everything through the lens of fear. "I don't want trouble," Jacob said, his voice cracking. "I'm leaving, I'm going back." The young Apache took a step forward, still speaking, his hand moving toward his chest in what might have been a gesture of peace or introduction. But Jacob saw only the movement, felt only the terror of stories he'd heard about settlers found dead in the wilderness, and his body reacted before his mind could catch up. The Colt cleared leather with practiced ease. Jacob had spent hours target shooting, preparing for exactly this kind of encounter, or so he'd thought. But no amount of practice could prepare someone for the reality of pointing a weapon at another human being. His hand shook violently. "Stay back," Jacob shouted. "I'm warning you!" The Apache stopped, his eyes widening, not with aggression but with understanding of the danger he was in. He began to raise his hands slowly, speaking rapidly now, the words tumbling over each other. If Jacob had been calmer, if he'd been wiser, if he'd been a different man, he might have recognized the young man's attempt to de-escalate the situation. Instead, when the Apache's hand moved too quickly toward his belt, perhaps reaching for something to show Jacob, perhaps simply reacting to his own fear, Jacob's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot cracked across the canyon like a thunderbolt, echoing off the stone walls and rolling away into the vast New Mexico sky. The young Apache's eyes went wide with shock and pain as the bullet struck him in the chest. He staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, and then collapsed onto the red earth. Jacob stood paralyzed, the smoking Colt hanging from his trembling hand, as the terrible reality of what he'd done crashed over him like a physical wave. The young Apache lay motionless on the ground, blood spreading across his chest in a dark stain that seemed to swallow the light itself. The silence that followed the gunshot was so complete, so profound, that Jacob could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God, what have I done?" He stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside the fallen man. Up close, Jacob could see that he was even younger than he'd first thought, barely more than a boy, really, with a face that had not yet lost all its youthful softness. The young Apache's eyes were still open, staring up at the cloudless sky, but they no longer saw anything. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth, and then, with a final, shuddering breath, he was gone. Jacob had killed him. Killed a man. The weight of it pressed down on his chest until he could barely breathe. He'd never hurt anyone in his life, had always thought of himself as a peaceful man, a civilized man. And now this unforgivable act, this death that could never be undone. For several minutes, Jacob remained frozen beside the body, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes could plainly see. Then, gradually, the practical concerns of survival began to penetrate his shock. He was deep in Apache territory. He'd just killed one of their people. If others came looking, and they would come looking, there would be no explaining, no trial, no chance to plead that it was an accident, a mistake born of fear and misunderstanding. He should have stayed there. He should have ridden immediately to the nearest army fort and turned himself in, explained what happened, thrown himself on the mercy of military justice. Instead, consumed by panic and self-preservation, Jacob made his second fatal mistake. He stood up, backing away from the body, and then turned and ran. He crashed through the scrub brush, calling frantically for Bartholomew, who had bolted at the sound of gunfire. His hands shook so badly he could barely pull himself into the saddle when he finally caught the terrified mule. Then he was riding hard for Salvation Ridge, not daring to look back. The image of the young Apache's dying face burned into his mind forever. Jacob reached his claim by mid-afternoon, his clothes soaked with sweat, his mind racing. He should leave immediately, he thought, pack what he could carry and ride hard for El Paso or Santa Fe, disappear into one of the larger cities where a man could vanish. But leaving meant abandoning his claim, his equipment, the small amount of silver he'd managed to extract. It meant starting over with nothing, assuming he could even make it safely out of the territory. Instead, he made his third and final mistake. He decided to wait, to see if anyone came looking. Perhaps no one had heard the shot. Perhaps the body wouldn't be found right away. Perhaps, and this was the thought he clung to most desperately, perhaps it hadn't really happened at all, and he'd wake up to find it was all just a terrible nightmare. 3 days passed in agonizing suspense. Jacob went through the motions of working his claim during the day, though his hands shook so badly he could barely hold his tools. At night, he lay awake in his tent, jumping at every sound, seeing the young Apache's face every time he closed his eyes. He stopped going into town, unable to face other people, terrified that somehow his guilt would be written across his face for all to see. On the 4th day, they came. Jacob was working near the entrance to his mine shaft when he became aware of the silence. The birds had stopped singing. The usual sounds of insects and small animals had ceased entirely. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. He straightened slowly, his hand moving toward his gun, and that's when he saw them. They emerged from the landscape itself, as if materializing from the rocks and scrub. There were 8 of them, Apache warriors mounted on horses that moved with silent grace. They formed a semicircle around Jacob's camp, cutting off any escape route. These were not young men. These were seasoned fighters, their faces weathered and hard, their eyes cold with purpose. At the center of the group rode a man who commanded immediate attention. He was in his late 40s, with silver threading through his long black hair and a bearing that spoke of unquestioned authority. He wore traditional Apache clothing adorned with symbols of rank, and across his chest hung a necklace of silver and turquoise that caught the afternoon light. But it was his face that made Jacob's blood run cold. The same high cheekbones, the same proud features he'd seen on the young man he'd killed. This was Chief Nantaje of the Chiricahua Apache, and Jacob had killed his son. The chief raised his hand, and 2 warriors dismounted, moving toward Jacob with swift efficiency. Jacob thought about running, about reaching for his gun, but he knew it would be futile. There were too many of them, and they moved with the confidence of men who had never lost a fight. Instead, he simply stood there, paralyzed by fear and guilt, as they closed in on him. They bound his hands roughly behind his back, the rope cutting into his wrists. One of the warriors retrieved Jacob's gun, examining it briefly before tucking it into his belt. Throughout all of this, Chief Nantaje sat motionless on his horse, his eyes never leaving Jacob's face. When the warriors finished binding Jacob, Chief Nantaje finally spoke. His English was good, learned through years of negotiations with the army and traders, but his words carried a weight that went beyond mere language. "You killed my son," he said simply. Each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread through the very air. 4 days ago, in the sacred canyon of our ancestors, you took the life of Nayati, my firstborn, the future of our people. Jacob tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but his throat had closed up entirely. All he could manage was a strangled sound of despair. "You were in forbidden territory," the chief continued, his voice never rising, never showing emotion beyond a terrible, controlled fury. "My son went there to pray, to seek vision from the spirits. He was unarmed, carrying only sacred items for ceremony. The rifle on his back had no bullets. He had given them all away the week before, as part of his preparation for manhood ritual." The words hit Jacob like physical blows. Unarmed, going to pray. It had all been in his mind, all his fear and paranoia projected onto an innocent encounter. The young man, Nayati, had been trying to warn him away, trying to help him avoid desecrating a holy place. "I didn't know," Jacob finally managed to gasp out. "I was scared. I thought I didn't mean to." "What you meant does not matter," Chief Nantaje said, cutting him off. "What you thought does not matter. My son is dead by your hand, and that is all that exists now. You have taken from me what cannot be replaced. You have torn a hole in the fabric of our world that can never be repaired." Jacob began to weep then, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with sobs. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "God, I'm so sorry. Please, I'm so sorry." Chief Nantaje studied him for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes. Not forgiveness, never that, but perhaps the acknowledgement of Jacob's genuine anguish. When he spoke again, his voice was somehow even more terrible for its quietness. "You are sorry now, yes, you feel what you have done. This is good. It means you are not an animal, not a man without soul. But sorry does not bring back my son. Sorry does not restore him to his mother, who has not stopped wailing since we found his body. Sorry does not give him the life he should have lived, the children he should have fathered, the wisdom he should have shared with his people." The chief paused, seeming to struggle with his own emotions for the first time. When he continued, his voice was rough with suppressed grief. "Our law is clear. A life for a life. By rights I should kill you here and now, and your death would barely begin to balance what you have taken. But my son was special, beloved by all our people. His death deserves more than your quick execution." Jacob felt his bladder loosen with terror. He'd heard the stories, the whispered tales around campfires about Apache torture methods, about captives who'd been kept alive for days in unimaginable agony. "Please," he begged, abandoning all pride, all dignity. "Please just shoot me. Hang me. Whatever you want, but please make it quick." Chief Nantage shook his head slowly. "You misunderstand. I do not speak of torture for revenge, for satisfaction of bloodlust. That is the way of the white man, who kills for pleasure and calls it justice. No, what I speak of is something different, something that will honor my son's memory while teaching you the weight of what you have done." He gestured to his warriors, who hauled Jacob roughly to his feet. "You will live, Jacob Mercer. You will live for 800 days, one for each year of life my son should have had, multiplied by the 40 summers he would have seen. But you will not live as a man. You will not live in freedom. You will live in the place where life and death meet, in the space between earth and sky, between being and nothingness. And when those 800 days are complete, if you survive them, you will be released. This is the judgment of Chief Nantage, witnessed by the spirits of our ancestors and bound by the sacred law of our people." Jacob didn't understand what the chief meant, but the formal way he spoke, the ritual quality of the words, filled him with a dread that went beyond mere physical fear. This was something ancient, something that reached back into tribal traditions that predated the arrival of white men in these lands by countless generations. They tied him to a horse, and the group began to move. Jacob twisted in his bonds, looking back at his camp, at the simple tent and mining equipment that had represented his dreams of a better life. Within minutes, they disappeared behind a ridge, and Jacob was being led away from everything he'd ever known, into a wilderness that suddenly seemed far more vast and terrible than he'd ever imagined. They rode for 3 days, following trails that Jacob could barely perceive, moving through landscapes of stark beauty and harsh indifference. The journey took them deep into territories that few white men had ever seen and lived to describe. They traveled through slot canyons where the walls rose so high and close that the sky became a ribbon of blue overhead. They crossed mesas where ancient ruins crumbled in the sun, remnants of civilizations that had thrived and vanished long before the Spanish had arrived. They descended into valleys where hot springs bubbled from the earth, filling the air with the smell of sulfur and minerals. Throughout the journey, Jacob was given water and small amounts of food, enough to keep him alive, but not enough to sustain his strength. He was not mistreated, not beaten or tormented, but he was utterly ignored. The warriors spoke among themselves in their own language, sometimes laughing at private jokes, sometimes falling into long silences. Chief Nantage rode at the front of the group, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the horizon, never once looking back at his prisoner. On the evening of the 3rd day, they entered a region of twisted rock formations that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Stone pillars rose from the earth like the fingers of giants, carved into impossible shapes by wind and water over millions of years. The rock itself was striped with colors Jacob had no names for, bands of red and orange and purple that glowed in the setting sun as if lit from within. "Iron Canyon," one of the warriors said. The first English words Jacob had heard from anyone except the chief in 3 days. The man's tone was somber, almost reverent. "The place where the earth breathes." They rode single file through a narrow passage between towering walls of stone, the horses' hooves echoing in the confined space. The passage twisted and turned, descending gradually, until Jacob lost all sense of direction. The air grew cooler, and he could hear the sound of water somewhere in the distance. Not the rush of a river, but a steady, rhythmic dripping, like the heartbeat of the canyon itself. Finally, they emerged into a vast chamber open to the sky. The walls rose nearly 200 feet on all sides, carved with natural alcoves and overhangs that created deep shadows. In the center of the chamber stood a single pillar of stone, perhaps 10 feet in diameter, rising 30 feet into the air. The stone was smooth, worn by centuries of wind and rain, and around its base were carved symbols that Jacob couldn't decipher. Ancient markings that predated even the Apache presence in these lands. Chief Nantaje dismounted and walked slowly to the pillar. He placed his hand on the stone, his head bowed, and spoke in his native tongue. A prayer, perhaps, or an invocation to the spirits he believed dwelt in this place. The other warriors remained on their horses, their heads also bowed, participating in some ritual that Jacob could only observe from the outside. When the chief finished his prayer, he turned to face Jacob. In the fading light, his features seemed carved from the same stone as the pillar behind him. "This place is sacred to my people," he said. "Long before the Apache came to these lands, the ancient ones lived here. They built great cities and studied the stars and understood mysteries that are lost to us now. When they vanished, they left places of power behind, places where the walls between worlds grow thin, where a man can see visions and speak with spirits." He gestured to the pillar. "This stone has stood here for longer than memory. It has witnessed the rise and fall of nations, the birth and death of countless generations. To be chained to this stone is to stand at the center of time itself, to experience every moment as if it were both the first and the last. It is not torture, Jacob Mercer. It is transformation. It is the price of understanding what you have done." Two warriors dismounted and dragged Jacob to the pillar. They unlashed thick iron chains from their saddlebags, chains that had clearly been prepared specifically for this purpose. The metal was dark with age, and as they wrapped the chains around Jacob's body, he could feel that they were surprisingly heavy, far heavier than iron should be. They secured him to the pillar in a standing position, with chains around his chest, his waist, and his thighs. His arms were pulled behind him, secured around the stone with manacles that bit into his wrists. His legs were spread and chained at the ankles. He could shift his weight slightly, could move his head, but he couldn't sit, couldn't lie down, couldn't do anything but stand against that ancient stone. "You will remain here for 800 days, Chief Nantaje said. "Every 10 days warriors will come. They will give you water and food. They will remove your waste. They will ensure you do not die. But that is all. You will not be freed. You will not be given comfort. You will stand here, Jacob Mercer, and you will think about what you have done. You will feel the weight of my son's stolen life with every breath you take." Jacob's voice came out as a croak. "I'll die. No one can survive that. It's not possible." "Many have stood at this stone," the chief replied. "Some for crimes against our people, some as part of sacred vision quests, some as punishment for breaking tribal law. Most survive. Some do not. Some go mad. Some find enlightenment. What happens to you will depend on the strength of your spirit and the truth of your remorse." He stepped closer, his face inches from Jacob's, and for the first time, Jacob saw the full depth of the chief's grief in his eyes, a bottomless well of pain that no revenge could ever fill. "My son Nayati was a gentle soul. He loved music and stories. He could track a deer for 3 days without rest. He made his mother laugh with his impersonations of the pompous Indian agents. He was learning to be a healer, studying the old ways with our medicine man. He would have been a great leader, a bridge between our world and the one that is coming. All of that is gone now, because you were afraid." Tears streamed down Jacob's face. "I would take it back if I could. I would trade places with him in an instant. I would die right now if it would bring him back." "But you cannot," Chief Nantaje said softly. "And that is the truth you must carry. That is the weight that will press down on you every moment of every day for the next 800 days. Perhaps, at the end of that time, you will understand what it means to take a life. Perhaps you will emerge from this place a different man, a man who understands the value of the breath in his lungs and the beating of his heart." The chief turned and walked back to his horse. The other warriors were already mounting up, preparing to leave. Jacob felt panic rising in his chest like a tide. "Wait," he cried out. "Please, you can't just leave me here. What about animals? What about storms? What if I die before the 10 days? Chief Nantaje paused, one hand on his saddle. "Then you die. but I do not think you will. This place, it protects those who stand at the stone. It is sacred, and the spirits here are old and powerful. They will decide your fate, not I." And then they were gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance, leaving Jacob alone in the growing darkness with nothing but the sound of dripping water and his own ragged breathing. The silence that descended was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. So complete, so profound that it seemed to have weight and texture. He could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing through his veins, could hear sounds his body made that he'd never noticed before because they'd always been drowned out by the noise of living. The first night was the worst. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, and Jacob quickly learned one of the many torments that awaited him. The chains allowed him to shift his weight from one leg to the other, but not to sit or rest. His legs began to ache within the first hour, a dull throb that gradually intensified into a burning agony. He tried to take pressure off one leg, but that only made the other hurt worse. He tried to lean against the pillar, but the chains were positioned in such a way that this was impossible. They held him just far enough away from the stone that he had to support his own weight. By midnight, his legs were trembling uncontrollably. Cramps seized his calves and thighs, twisting the muscles into knots of pure pain. He cried out into the darkness, but the only answer was the echo of his own voice bouncing off the canyon walls. He begged for mercy from a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. He cursed Chief Nantaje, cursed the Apache, cursed the day he decided to come west. And then, as exhaustion finally began to dull the sharp edges of his pain, he thought about Nayati. He pictured the young man as he'd last seen him, lying in the red dust with blood spreading across his chest. He thought about the chief's words, about how Nayati had been going to pray, about how he'd been unarmed, about all the life that had been stolen in a single moment of fear and poor judgment. Jacob wept then, but these tears were different from the ones he'd shed before. These tears came from somewhere deeper, from a place of genuine remorse that went beyond self-pity and fear of punishment. For the first time, he truly grasped the enormity of what he'd done, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. He had erased a person from existence. He had caused pain to people he'd never even met. He had set in motion ripples that would spread through the Apache community for generations. As dawn broke over the canyon rim, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson, Jacob hung in his chains, half delirious with pain and exhaustion. His legs had gone numb below the knees, which was almost worse than the pain had been. He couldn't feel the ground beneath his feet anymore, couldn't tell if he was still standing or if the chains were holding him up by his torso. The sun climbed higher, and new torments began. The stone pillar at his back, which had been blessedly cool during the night, began to heat up. By mid-morning, it was almost too hot to touch, and Jacob could feel it through his shirt, baking his back and shoulders. The chains, too, grew hot, the metal burning against any skin it touched. He tried to shift away from the heated stone, but there was nowhere to go. Thirst became his constant companion. His tongue swelled in his mouth. His lips cracked and bled. He'd been given water before the warriors left, but not nearly enough to sustain a man standing in the desert sun. He found himself staring at the place where he could hear water dripping somewhere in the shadows of the canyon. So close, maybe only 50 feet away, but it might as well have been on the moon. By the afternoon of the second day, Jacob began to hallucinate. He saw figures moving in the shadows, not threatening, just watching. Sometimes they looked like people he'd known back east. His mother, his childhood friends, a girl he'd courted before coming west. Sometimes they looked like Nayati, the young Apache standing silently at the edge of the clearing, his chest unmarred by any wound, his eyes sad but not accusing. "I'm sorry," Jacob whispered to the phantom. "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." But the figure never spoke, never moved, just watched with those dark, sorrowful eyes before fading back into the heat shimmer. Time lost all meaning. Jacob couldn't tell if hours were passing or days. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind protecting itself from the relentless assault of pain and thirst by periodically shutting down. When he was conscious, everything was agony. When he drifted away, He found himself in strange dreams, where he was both himself and Nayati simultaneously, experiencing the moment of the shooting from both perspectives, feeling the terror of the shooter and the confusion of the victim, the bullet traveling through time like a messenger of fate. On the morning of what he thought might be the third day, though it could have been the 5th or the 10th for all he knew, Jacob heard the sound of horses. His heart leaped with desperate hope. The warriors were coming back. They would give him water. They would feed him. They might even decide that he'd suffered enough and release him. 3 Apache warriors entered the canyon, but they weren't the same ones who'd brought him here. These were younger men, barely older than Nayati had been, and they regarded Jacob with expressions that mixed curiosity with contempt. They approached the pillar slowly, and Jacob noticed that they gave the stone itself a wide berth, as if afraid to get too close. One of them carried a water skin. He uncorked it and held it to Jacob's lips, supporting his head with surprising gentleness. Jacob drank greedily, coughing and sputtering, trying to consume as much as possible before it was taken away. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but it was the most delicious thing he'd ever experienced. After he'd drunk his fill, one of the warriors produced some dried meat and pressed it to Jacob's lips. The food was harder to manage. Jacob's jaw muscles had cramped from dehydration and from unconsciously clenching his teeth against the pain. It took him several minutes of chewing to soften the meat enough to swallow. The warriors waited patiently, not speaking, just watching him with those unreadable dark eyes. When he'd finished eating, they attended to the humiliating necessity of dealing with his bodily waste. They'd brought rags and a bucket, and they cleaned him with efficient, emotionless movements. Jacob wanted to die from shame, but he was too far gone to protest, too broken to maintain any semblance of dignity. Before they left, one of the warriors spoke. His English was halting but understandable. "Chief says you speak to stone. Stone has medicine. Maybe stone teaches you what you need to know." "How long has it been?" Jacob croaked. "How many days?" The warrior held up both hands, fingers spread. 10 days. You have 790 more. 790. The number crashed over Jacob like a physical weight. He'd thought surely it had been longer, 2 weeks at least, maybe 3. But it had only been 10 days, and he'd already been reduced to this pathetic state. How could he possibly survive another 790 days? "I can't," he whispered. "I can't do this. Please, please just kill me." But the warriors were already leaving, their footsteps fading into the distance, and Jacob was alone again with the stone and the silence and the slowly creeping shadows. Something changed after that first visit, though Jacob couldn't have explained what it was. Perhaps his body had adapted somewhat to the constant standing, or perhaps his mind had simply accepted the reality of his situation and stopped fighting against it. The pain was still there. It never really went away. But it became more of a background noise, something he could almost ignore when he focused on other things. And focus he did, because the alternative was madness. He began to notice details about his surroundings that he'd missed before. The way the light moved across the canyon walls throughout the day, creating patterns that repeated with mechanical precision. The sounds of birds that nested in the high alcoves, their calls marking the passing hours as reliably as any clock. The smell of the air, which changed subtly with the weather, drier before hot days, with a hint of moisture before the rare rains that would sweep through the canyon. He studied the symbols carved into the base of the pillar, trying to decipher their meaning. They were worn smooth by time, barely visible in most light, but when the sun hit them at just the right angle, they seemed to glow with a faint inner light. Some looked like animals, deer, birds, snakes. Others were geometric patterns that hurt his eyes to look at for too long, designs that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. And he thought. God, how he thought. With nothing to do but stand and breathe and exist, Jacob's mind turned inward with an intensity he'd never experienced before. He thought about his life, about every choice he'd made that had led him to this moment. He thought about his childhood in Philadelphia, about the comfortable home and loving parents he'd taken for granted. He thought about the restlessness that had driven him west, the vague dissatisfaction with a life that, in retrospect, had been blessed beyond measure. He thought about Nayati, not just the moment of his death, but the life he must have lived before. Jacob tried to imagine what it had been like to grow up in the Apache tribe, to learn to track and hunt, to sit around fires listening to the stories of elders. He thought about Nayati's mother, whom he'd never met, and tried to picture her grief. He thought about the friends and siblings Nayati must have had, about the girl who might have been waiting to marry him, about the children who would now never be born. The weight of it was crushing, but Jacob didn't look away from it anymore. He let himself feel the full horror of what he'd done, let it wash over him in waves that left him gasping and sobbing. And in those moments of absolute despair, something strange began to happen. He began to feel the presence of something else in the canyon with him. At first, Jacob thought he was hallucinating again, that his mind was conjuring phantoms to keep him company in his isolation. But this presence was different from the fleeting visions he'd experienced before. It didn't have a form exactly. It was more like a weight in the air, a sense of being watched by something ancient and patient. Sometimes it felt almost benevolent, like a grandmother watching a child learn a difficult lesson. Other times it felt utterly alien, so far removed from human understanding that Jacob's mind couldn't even begin to categorize it. The warriors had said the stone had medicine, that it could teach. At the time, Jacob had dismissed it as superstition, but now he wasn't so sure. There were moments, usually in the deep hours of night, when he could swear he felt the stone at his back pulse with something like a heartbeat. There were times when the symbols carved into its base seemed to rearrange themselves, forming new patterns that conveyed meaning without words. He started to talk to the stone, at first just to hear the sound of his own voice, to maintain some connection to language and humanity. "I killed him," he would say. "I killed Nayati because I was afraid. Didn't mean to, but that doesn't matter, does it? Dead is dead. Gone is gone." And sometimes, in the quality of the silence that followed his words, Jacob would sense something like a response. Not forgiveness, never that, but perhaps acknowledgement, understanding. The stone had witnessed countless lives, countless deaths, countless moments of human folly and tragedy. His crime was terrible, but it was not unique. Men had been killing each other since the dawn of time, and they would continue to do so long after Jacob was dust. This thought brought him no comfort, only a deeper understanding of the cyclical nature of violence and grief. How many fathers had lost sons throughout history? How many mothers had wailed for children who would never come home? His personal tragedy was just one small note in an endless symphony of human suffering. By the time the warriors came for their second visit, day 20, Jacob had changed in ways that went beyond the physical. His body had adapted as much as it was able to the constant standing. He'd learned to lock his knees in a way that allowed him to doze standing up, catching brief moments of rest without collapsing entirely. His legs were scarred from the chains, his wrists raw and infected, but he was still alive, still conscious, still aware. But it was his mental state that had undergone the most profound transformation. The panic and desperation of the first 10 days had given way to something else, a kind of acceptance perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion too deep for further resistance. He no longer begged the warriors to free him or kill him. He simply drank the water they offered, ate the food they provided, and submitted to their ministrations without complaint. One of the warriors, a man with a scar running down his left cheek, studied Jacob with what might have been curiosity. "You still alive?" he said, his English better than Jacob had expected. "Some men, they already dead inside by now, broken. But you..." He paused, searching for the right words. "You still here, still seeing." "I see what I did," Jacob replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I see it every day, every night. I see his face when I close my eyes. I see the moment when the light went out of him. I see what I took from the world." The warrior nodded slowly. "This is good. This means the stone is teaching you. Chief Nantaje will be pleased to hear this. He feared you would die without learning, without understanding. That would honor no one." After they left, Jacob thought about those words for a long time. Chief Nantaje wanted him to understand, to learn. This wasn't just punishment, it was education of the most brutal kind. The chief could have killed him instantly, could have tortured him and been done with it. Instead, he'd chosen this prolonged ordeal specifically because he believed something valuable might come from it. The seasons began to change. The brutal heat of late summer gradually gave way to the more moderate temperatures of autumn. Jacob learned to track time by the angle of the sun, by the changing behavior of the birds and insects, by the subtle shifts in the air that preceded weather changes. He watched thunderstorms roll across the canyon, great walls of rain that never quite reached his pillar, leaving him tantalizingly close to relief, but never quite touching him. He watched the stars wheel overhead at night, learning their patterns, finding shapes and meaning in their arrangements. By day 30, he'd stopped thinking of himself as Jacob Mercer from Philadelphia. That person seemed like someone from another lifetime, someone naive and foolish who'd thought he understood the world. He was becoming something else now, something without a name, something defined entirely by this moment, this pillar, this penance. By day 40, he'd begun to hear things in the wind that moved through the canyon. Not voices exactly, but something like music, tones and rhythms that seemed to carry information he couldn't quite decode. Sometimes he would wake from his standing doze to find that he'd been humming along with these phantom melodies, his voice cracked and harsh, but following the patterns instinctively. By day 50, he started to have visions that were different from the hallucinations of those first terrible days. These were clearer, more coherent, with a narrative quality that suggested they were more than just his mind breaking down. He saw the ancient ones who'd built cities in these canyons, saw them studying the stars and marking the passage of time with elaborate ceremonies. He saw the first Apache arriving in these lands, migrating down from the north, learning to survive in the harsh desert environment. He saw generations of people coming to this pillar, standing where he stood, seeking wisdom or paying penance or communing with whatever spirits dwelt in this place. And he saw Nayati, not as a ghost or phantom, but as a living, breathing person going about his daily life. Jacob watched him learn to hunt from his father, watched him laugh with his friends, watched him sit quietly beside a stream, lost in contemplation. These visions were so vivid that Jacob felt he was actually there, invisible but present, bearing witness to the life he'd stolen. In one vision he saw Nayati as a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, crying because he'd accidentally killed a bird with a stone from his sling. Chief Nantaje, younger then, his hair still fully black, knelt beside his son and spoke to him with surprising gentleness. "All life is sacred," the chief said in the vision. "To take a life, even a small one, is a grave thing. You must honor this bird's spirit, must thank it for the lesson it has taught you, and you must remember this feeling, this sadness, so that you never take life carelessly." Young Nayati had buried the bird with elaborate ceremony, marking the spot with stones and offering prayers to its spirit. The memory, if that's what it was, hit Jacob with stunning force. Nayati had been taught from childhood to respect life, to feel grief at even accidental killing, and Jacob had shot him down without a second thought, driven by nothing more than fear and prejudice. The cruelty of it, the waste of it, overwhelmed him all over again. "I'm sorry," Jacob whispered to the memory, to the ghost, to whatever part of Nayati's spirit might still linger in this place. "I'm so desperately sorry. You were worth 100 of me, and I took you from the world like you were nothing." The vision faded, but something remained, a sense of Nayati's presence, not accusing, not angry, just present. Jacob had read somewhere that Native Americans believed the spirits of the dead could linger in places that were sacred to them. If that was true, then perhaps Nayati was here in some way, watching his killer suffer, witnessing the slow transformation taking place. The third visit came on day 30, then day 40, then day 50. Each time Jacob noticed subtle changes in how the warriors treated him. They were still not friendly, still maintained their distance, but there was a growing respect in their eyes. They would sometimes linger after tending to his needs, watching him with expressions that suggested they were evaluating something beyond his mere physical survival. On day 60, one of the younger warriors, a man who couldn't have been more than 20, spoke to him in halting English. "My sister. She was to marry Nayati. They had been promised since children. Now she will not marry at all. She says her heart died with him." Jacob closed his eyes, feeling the weight of yet another life damaged by his action. "Tell her." He paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. "Tell her that I carry her grief with me. Tell her that I will never forget what was lost. Tell her that if I survive this, I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor Nayati's memory by being the kind of man he was, the kind who would weep for a bird." The warrior looked puzzled by that last phrase, but he nodded slowly. "I will tell her. Maybe it helps, maybe not. But I will tell her." Time continued its relentless march. Day 70, day 80, day 90. The autumn deepened, and the nights grew cold enough that Jacob shivered constantly in the darkness, his teeth chattering, his body trying desperately to generate warmth it couldn't maintain. The warriors brought him a blanket on day 100, draping it over his shoulders, a small mercy that nonetheless made an enormous difference. By day 110, Jacob had stopped counting. The specific number didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the eternal present, this breath, this moment, this heartbeat. He'd learned to enter a state that was neither fully conscious nor unconscious, a kind of waking dream where hours could pass like minutes. In this state, the line between himself and his surroundings blurred. He became the stone at his back, ancient and patient. He became the wind moving through the canyon. He became the water dripping in the shadows, wearing away rock one drop at a time across millennia. During one of these episodes, he experienced something that would stay with him forever. He felt himself split into two beings, one still chained to the pillar, suffering and enduring, and another floating free above the canyon, looking down at the pathetic figure below. From this elevated perspective, he could see the geometric perfection of the canyon's design, could see how the pillar stood at the exact center of a natural amphitheater, positioned to catch the sun's rays at specific times of day and year. And he could see lines of energy, for lack of a better word, flowing through the landscape like rivers of light. They converged on the pillar from all directions, spiraling around it before shooting up into the sky. The pillar wasn't just a stone, it was some kind of focal point, a place where the Earth's power concentrated and intensified. When he returned to his body, though he was never quite sure if he'd actually left it or simply experienced an elaborate hallucination, Jacob understood why this place was sacred. It wasn't superstition or primitive belief. There was something genuinely special about this location, something that affected consciousness in measurable ways. The ancient ones had known it. The Apache knew it. And now Jacob knew it too. By day 150, roughly 5 months into his ordeal, Jacob noticed that his body had begun to adapt in unexpected ways. The constant standing had reshaped his musculature, making his legs and core incredibly strong, despite his overall weakness from inadequate nutrition. His senses had sharpened dramatically. He could hear the approach of the warriors long before they arrived, could smell rain on the air hours before the clouds appeared, could detect the subtle changes in temperature that signaled the passage from day to night. But more striking were the changes to his perception. He no longer saw the world in the simple, straightforward way he had before. Everything seemed layered now, possessed of multiple meanings and dimensions. A rock was not just a rock. It was a story of geological time, a home for insects and lizards, a marker of location, a tool waiting to be discovered. A bird was not just a bird, it was a miracle of evolution, a singer of complex songs, a creature with its own inner life and awareness. Most importantly, he'd begun to understand something about the nature of life and death that he'd never grasped before. They weren't opposites, but rather parts of a continuous cycle, like inhaling and exhaling. Nayati wasn't gone in any absolute sense. His matter had returned to the earth, where it would be taken up by plants and animals, transformed and recycled endlessly. His energy, his spirit, whatever you wanted to call it, had dispersed back into the great pool of consciousness that animated all things. This understanding didn't lessen Jacob's guilt. If anything, it made it more profound. Because if life and death were indeed part of the same cycle, then interrupting that cycle prematurely, cutting short a life that should have continued for decades, was a violation of the natural order itself. Jacob hadn't just killed a person. He'd disrupted the intricate web of relationships and energies that connected all things. The ripples from that disruption would spread outward indefinitely, affecting people and situations he would never even know about. Winter came to Iron Canyon with surprising ferocity. Snow fell several times, dusting the red rocks with white and turning the canyon into something from a dream. Jacob, with no protection beyond his blanket and the minimal shelter provided by the pillar itself, suffered terribly. His fingers and toes went numb, and he feared frostbite would claim them. His lips split and bled. His entire body shook with cold that penetrated to his bones. Yet somehow, he survived. The warriors came every 10 days without fail, even through the worst of the winter storms, bringing food and water and the minimal care necessary to keep him alive. They changed his blanket when the old one became too soiled, brought slightly warmer clothing, even packed snow around his feet to prevent the worst of the frostbite. On day 200, as winter began to loosen its grip and the first signs of spring appeared in the greening of desert plants, Chief Nantaje came to visit for the first time since Jacob had been chained to the pillar. The chief looked older than Jacob remembered, the silver in his hair more prominent, the lines in his face deeper. He stood at a distance from the pillar, studying Jacob with an intensity that made the younger man feel as if his very soul was being examined. Finally, the chief spoke. "You are still alive. This surprises me. I thought perhaps you would find a way to die, to suffocate yourself or stop your heart through will alone. Some men can do this, you know, but you have not." "I don't have the right to die," Jacob replied, his voice rough but steady. "Dying would be the easy way out. Living with what I've done, truly living with it, not just surviving but understanding, that's the real punishment. And maybe if I'm very lucky, it's also the path to something like redemption." Chief Nantaje's eyebrows rose slightly. "You have changed. The man I chained to this stone 6 months ago would not have said such things. He would have begged and pleaded and made promises he had no intention of keeping. But you..." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "You have begun to see." "The stone has taught me," Jacob said. "Or maybe it's just stripped away all the lies I told myself about who I was and what the world is. I don't know anymore. All I know is that I understand now, really understand, what I took from the world when I killed your son. And I understand that I can never repay that debt, no matter how long I stand here, no matter how much I suffer. Some things can't be balanced. Some wounds can't be healed." The chief nodded slowly. "This is wisdom, not the kind you learn from books or from other men's words, but the kind you learn from the earth itself, from time and suffering and silence. My son would have appreciated this wisdom. He was always seeking such understanding." Tears ran down Jacob's face, cutting tracks through the grime and weathering of 6 months' exposure. "Tell me about him. Please. I see him in visions sometimes, but I want to know the real person, the one who existed beyond my brief, terrible encounter with him." For a moment, Jacob thought the chief would refuse, would walk away without another word. But then, surprisingly, Chief Nantaje began to speak. Nayati was born during a thunderstorm, in the season when the saguaros bloom. His mother said he came into the world laughing, which is rare for babies. As a child, he was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked and why they were the way they were. This frustrated some of the elders, who thought he should simply accept tradition without question. But I encouraged it. I knew that the world was changing, that the old ways would need to adapt, and that my son's curiosity might be exactly what our people needed. The chief paused, his eyes distant, lost in memory. He loved music. He could play the flute so beautifully that even the birds would stop to listen. He would compose songs about the desert, about the mountains, about the changing seasons. Some of them were funny, making people laugh until they cried. Others were so sad and beautiful that grown warriors would weep. Jacob listened, absorbing every word, building a more complete picture of the person he'd killed. Each detail made his guilt deeper, but he welcomed it. He needed to know. He needed to understand the full weight of what had been lost. He was also brave, the chief continued. When he was 14, a younger child fell into a canyon during a flash flood. Without hesitation, Nayati jumped in after him. The water was violent, filled with debris, and everyone thought both boys would die. But Nayati managed to grab the child and hold him above water until others could pull them to safety. He broke his arm in 3 places, but he saved that boy's life. The chief looked directly at Jacob then, and his voice took on a harder edge. That boy he saved is now 15. He will grow up, will have children of his own, will live a full life because my son was willing to risk his own life for him. Do you understand? Nayati valued life, all life, more than his own comfort or safety. And you took him from us because you were afraid of a shadow. I know, Jacob whispered. I know, and it destroys me every day. There is no punishment you could devise that's worse than what I do to myself in my own mind. Chief Nantaje studied him for a long moment, then nodded once curtly. 600 days remain. We will see if you survive them. We will see what man emerges from this stone, if any man emerges at all. Then he was gone, and Jacob was alone again with his thoughts and his guilt and the patient, watching presence of the stone. The encounter with Chief Nantaje marked a turning point in Jacob's ordeal. Before he'd been enduring, surviving, learning. But now he had a clearer sense of purpose. He wasn't just serving time or paying a debt. He was being transformed, alchemically changed by suffering and isolation into something new. Whether that something would be better or worse than what he'd been before remained to be seen. Spring brought new life to the canyon. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible crevices, splashes of color against the red rock. Birds returned from wherever they'd spent the winter, filling the air with song. Even the quality of the sunlight seemed different. Softer, more golden, less harsh than the brutal glare of summer or the cold clarity of winter. Jacob watched it all with eyes that saw differently than they had a year ago. He noticed details that would have been invisible to his former self. The way a particular flower always opened its petals at exactly the same time each morning. The complex social dynamics of the bird colony in the high alcoves. The subtle shifts in the wind patterns that indicated changing weather days in advance. By day 300, he'd become something of a fixture in the local ecosystem. Birds would land on the pillar near his head, unconcerned by his presence. Lizards would sun themselves on his feet. Once, a snake coiled in the shade near his ankles for an entire afternoon, and Jacob simply watched it, feeling no fear, only a kind of kinship with another creature trying to survive in a harsh environment. The warriors who came every 10 days had stopped treating him as a prisoner and begun treating him almost as a curiosity, or perhaps a kind of shaman. They would ask him questions sometimes, about the weather, about dreams they'd had, about decisions they were facing. Jacob would answer as best he could, drawing on the strange wisdom he'd accumulated during his long vigil at the stone. One young warrior, whose name Jacob learned was Kuruk, seemed particularly interested in his transformation. "They say you can see the future now," he said on one visit. "They say the stone has opened your eyes to things normal men cannot see." "I don't see the future," Jacob replied, "but I see patterns more clearly. Everything moves in cycles. The seasons, the movements of animals, the behavior of people. Once you understand the patterns, you can make educated guesses about what comes next. It's not magic, it's just attention. Deep, sustained attention over a long period of time." Kuruk nodded thoughtfully. "And what patterns do you see for our people? For the Apache?" Jacob hesitated. This was dangerous territory, but something about the young warrior's earnest face made him speak truthfully. I see the pattern of what happened to other tribes. I see the wave of settlers coming west, and I see that it won't stop. I see that the old ways are ending, not because they're wrong or bad, but because the world is changing too fast. The question isn't whether the Apache will survive, it's how. Will they adapt while keeping their core identity, or will they fight until they're destroyed? Kuruk's face darkened. You speak of surrender. No, Jacob said firmly. I speak of transformation. The Apache have survived this long because they're adaptable, because they're strong, because they know how to change without losing what makes them who they are. That strength will be needed more than ever in the years to come. Not the strength of warriors, though that matters too, but the strength to hold onto your identity while everything around you is trying to erase it. The young warrior considered this for a long time before finally nodding and walking away. Jacob didn't know if his words had any impact, but he'd spoken what he believed to be true, cost what it may. By day 400, the heat of summer had returned, but Jacob found he could endure it better than he had the previous year. His body had adapted, had learned to conserve water and regulate temperature more efficiently. His skin had darkened and toughened, providing some protection from the sun. His mind had learned to retreat into cool, dark places during the worst of the afternoon heat, entering meditative states where time seemed to slow or stop entirely. During one of these deep meditations, Jacob experienced what could only be described as a vision of stunning clarity and power. He saw the history of the stone itself, reaching back millions of years. He saw it formed in the crucible of volcanic activity, saw it rise from beneath the Earth's surface, saw it worn and shaped by wind and water over unimaginable stretches of time. He saw the first humans arrive in this land, crossing the land bridge from Asia, spreading south and east, learning to survive in diverse environments. He saw the ancient ones build their great cities, saw them flourish and then collapse when the climate shifted and the rains failed. He saw the Apache arrive, saw them adapt their culture to the southwestern deserts, saw them develop the intricate knowledge of place that allowed them to thrive where others would perish. And he saw the future, or a possible future, at least. He saw more settlers coming, saw conflicts escalate and eventually wind down. He saw reservations established, saw the Apache forced into smaller and smaller areas. But he also saw them endure, saw their culture and identity persist, even under the most difficult circumstances. He saw their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carrying forward the essential core of who they were, even as the external forms changed. When the vision faded, Jacob was weeping, but these were not tears of grief. They were tears of awe at the vastness of time and the resilience of life. Everything changed, everything evolved, everything adapted or died. But the fundamental patterns remained constant. Life persisted, consciousness endured. The dance continued, even as individual dancers entered and exited the stage. On day 450, something unprecedented happened. A group of white men, trappers or prospectors by the look of them, stumbled into the canyon. There were 4 of them, rough-looking characters with weather-beaten faces and hard eyes. They stopped short when they saw Jacob chained to the pillar, their hands dropping instinctively to their weapons. Jesus Christ, one of them breathed. What in the hell happened to you? Jacob looked at them, these men who came from the same world he'd once inhabited, and found he had trouble remembering how to speak English in the casual, colloquial way they expected. I killed an Apache chief's son, he said simply. This is my punishment. I have 350 days remaining. The men exchanged glances. The hell you say, the apparent leader growled. He was a big man with a thick beard and a scar across his forehead. You mean to tell me the savages put you here, and you're just accepting it? I earned it, Jacob replied. I took a life out of fear and ignorance. This is justice. Justice? Another man spat into the dust. This is barbarism is what it is. You're a white man. They got no right to do this to you no matter what you did. Jacob felt something stir in his chest. Anger, perhaps, or maybe just profound disappointment at how little these men understood. They have every right. This is their land, and I violated their laws. More than that, I violated the fundamental law that exists above and beyond any human system, the law that says life is sacred, and taking it has consequences. The scarred leader shook his head. You've been out here too long, friend. You've gone native in the head. We'll get you down from there, get you back to civilization where you can be treated by a proper doctor. No, Jacob said firmly, you will not. If you try, you'll bring down the wrath of Chief Nantaje and his warriors on not just me, but on every white settler in this region. And you'll rob me of the one chance I have to make something meaningful out of what I've done. Please, I'm asking you to leave me here. The men argued among themselves for several minutes. Part of Jacob wanted to call out, to beg them to free him, to return him to the world of soft beds and cool drinks and freedom of movement. But a larger part of him knew that would be a betrayal of everything he'd learned, everything he'd become during his time at the stone. Finally, the leader turned back to him. You're sure about this? Really sure? I'm sure, Jacob said. Tell people what you've seen here if you want, but don't interfere. This is between me and the Apache, between me and the debt I owe. The men left, shaking their heads and muttering about madness and Stockholm Syndrome, and God only knew what else. Jacob watched them disappear through the canyon passage and felt a strange sense of relief. He'd been tested, tempted with rescue and comfort, and he'd chosen to stay. That choice, made freely, transformed his punishment into something else, into a kind of sacrifice, perhaps, or a pilgrimage. The next time the warriors came, it was Kuruk and two others. Jacob mentioned the white men's visit. Kuruk nodded, unsurprised. We were watching. We would have stopped them if they tried to free you. But Chief Nantaje said to wait, to see what you would do. He is pleased with your choice. I'm not doing this for his approval, Jacob said. I'm doing it because it's right, because I need to see this through to the end, whatever that end might be. We know, Kuruk replied. That is why the chief is pleased. As summer turned to autumn for the second time, Jacob found himself thinking more about what would happen when the 800 days were complete. Would he simply be released? Would there be some ceremony or ritual? Would he be expected to leave the territory forever? Or would there be some way for him to remain, to perhaps find a role as a bridge between the Apache and the white world? More pressingly, who would he be when he was finally unchained? The man who'd killed Nayati was long dead, killed by exposure and suffering and profound regret. But what had been born to replace him? Jacob wasn't sure he knew anymore. He'd been transformed so completely that his old identity seemed like a costume he'd once worn, or a role he'd played in a theatrical production that had long since closed. By day 500, he'd developed something that could only be described as a relationship with the stone itself. He would talk to it, not expecting answers, but simply as a way of organizing his thoughts. He would press his back against it and feel something. Not quite communication, but a sense of vast age and patience, of having witnessed so much over so long that nothing human beings did could surprise or shock it. Sometimes, in his deepest meditations, Jacob felt as if he could access the stone's memories, not in any literal sense, but as a kind of intuitive understanding of the countless people who had stood here before him, the hands that had carved those ancient symbols, the ceremonies and rituals that had been performed in this place over millennia. He saw himself as part of a long lineage of people who had come to the stone seeking transformation, or punishment, or enlightenment. Some had been criminals, some had been seekers, some had been broken individuals looking for a way to become whole. And the stone had witnessed them all with the same patient indifference, the same timeless presence. Winter returned, and with it new hardships. But Jacob endured them with a strength that came from deep within, from that core of understanding he'd developed during his long vigil. He knew now that he could survive almost anything, that the human spirit was far more resilient and adaptable than he'd ever imagined. On day 600, Chief Nantaje came to visit again. He looked at Jacob for a long time without speaking, his eyes searching, evaluating. Finally, he said, "In 200 days you will be released. Have you thought about what you will do with the rest of your life?" "Every day," Jacob replied. "I can never bring Nayati back. I can never undo what I did. But maybe I can live in a way that honors his memory. Maybe I can use what I've learned here to help others understand what I didn't. That fear leads to violence. That violence creates suffering that echoes through generations. That the only way to break the cycle is to choose differently." The chief nodded slowly. "And how would you do this? You are not Apache. You are not a chief or a teacher or a medicine man. You are just one man who killed my son and survived his punishment." "Maybe that's enough," Jacob said. "Maybe my story itself has value. If even one person hears about what happened to me and chooses not to pull a trigger out of fear, if even one conflict is avoided because someone remembers the price of violence, then maybe Nayati's death will have led to something other than just grief and loss." Chief Nantaje considered this for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost gentle. "My son believed that people could change. He believed that the white men and the Apache could find a way to live together, to learn from each other. Most of our people thought he was naive, too idealistic. Even I had doubts, though I encouraged him to hold on to his vision. And then you killed him. And it seemed to prove that his dream was impossible, that violence and fear would always win." He paused, his eyes glistening with moisture in the fading light. "But now I see you, transformed by suffering into someone who understands what my son understood. And I think perhaps he was right after all. Perhaps people can change. Perhaps there is hope for a future where our peoples do not simply destroy each other." Jacob felt something break open in his chest. Not pain exactly, but a release of tension he hadn't even known he was carrying. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that hope," he said. "I swear it on everything I've become, on every moment I've stood at this stone." The chief placed his hand on the stone near where Jacob's back pressed against it. "The stone accepts your oath. So do I. In 200 days you will be free. But you will never truly be free of what you did, and you will never truly be free of this place. It will be part of you forever, as my son's death is part of you forever. This is as it should be." After the chief left, Jacob stood in the gathering darkness, feeling the weight of what had been said. 200 days, just over 6 months. After so long, after so much suffering and transformation, the end was finally in sight. But rather than feeling joy or relief, Jacob felt something more complex. A mixture of anticipation and dread, of hope and uncertainty. Who would he be in the world beyond this canyon? How would he function in a society that seemed increasingly alien to him? Could he really make a difference? Or was he just another broken man with grand delusions? The winter that followed was the hardest yet, not because of the cold or the privation, but because Jacob's mind turned increasingly toward the future. During the first several hundred days, he'd been so focused on simple survival, on understanding what he'd done, on enduring moment by moment, that he hadn't thought much about what came after. But now the end was approaching, and with it came questions he couldn't answer. On day 700, Kuruk arrived with the regular supplies, but also with news. "Chief Nantaje's wife has died," he said quietly. "Her heart failed. The medicine man says she never recovered from losing Nayati. The grief ate at her from the inside until there was nothing left." Jacob felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. Another death to add to his tally. Another consequence of his moment of fear and poor judgment. "I've killed 2 people then," he said hoarsely. "Not just one." Kuruk shook his head. "The chief does not blame you for his wife's death. He says that grief is a choice in some ways. She chose to let it consume her, chose not to fight to stay alive for her other children and grandchildren. He mourns her, but he does not add her death to your account." "But I do," Jacob said. "I have to. She would be alive if I hadn't killed her son. That's just a fact." "Perhaps," Kuruk acknowledged. "But where does the chain of blame end? If you had not come west, you would not have killed Nayati. If your mother had not given birth to you, you would not have come west. If the first Europeans had never crossed the ocean, none of this would have happened. You can trace causation back to the beginning of time, but that does not mean you are responsible for everything that follows from your actions. I'm responsible for the direct consequences, Jacob insisted. That's enough. By day 750, spring had returned once more. The canyon burst into bloom, as it did every year, indifferent to human suffering and triumph alike. Jacob watched the familiar cycle with new appreciation, understanding now that he was seeing it for one of the last times. Soon he would leave this place, would return to a world of movement and change and constant distraction. Part of him dreaded it. The warriors had begun to prepare him for his release, bringing slightly more food, allowing him to move his limbs more during their visits, slowly rebuilding strength that had atrophied during his long imprisonment. They brought him new clothes to replace the tattered rags he wore, though he would not put them on until the day of his release. On day 775, Chief Nantaje came with his entire council, 7 elder warriors who'd served as advisors and leaders of the Apache for decades. They formed a semicircle around the pillar, and the chief spoke in both English and Apache, so that all could understand. Jacob Mercer has stood at the sacred stone for 775 days. In 25 more days, he will have completed the sentence of 800 days that was imposed upon him for the death of my son, Nayati. The council has gathered today to bear witness to his transformation and to decide what his status will be when he is released. One of the elders, a man so old his face was a map of wrinkles, spoke in Apache. Kuruk, who stood nearby, translated quietly for Jacob. Elder Nasha says that he has watched you from a distance many times during your imprisonment. He says the man who was chained to this stone is not the same man who stands here now. He says your spirit has been broken down and rebuilt, like a weapon that is melted and reforged into a new shape. Another elder spoke, and Kuruk translated again. Elder Goyathle says that some among our people will never forgive you, will always see you as the killer of Nayati. He says this is their right, and you must accept their hatred if you wish to remain in Apache territory. A third elder added his voice, and Kuruk's translation continued. Elder Kocheta says that the sacred stone has accepted you, has taught you, has allowed you to survive when many others would have died. He says this is a sign that the spirits have a purpose for you, though what that purpose is remains unclear. Chief Nantaje raised his hand, and the elders fell silent. The council has decided that when you are released, you will be given a choice. You may leave these lands forever, may return to the white world and never come back. No one will pursue you, and your debt will be considered paid. Or... He paused, letting the weight of the alternative hang in the air. Or you may stay. You may live among us, not as Apache. You will never be Apache, but as something else. A bridge, perhaps. A translator. Not just of language, but of understanding. Someone who knows both worlds and can help them understand each other. Jacob's heart hammered in his chest. He'd expected to be cast out, to be sent away with nothing but his life and the memories of what he'd endured. The possibility of staying, of remaining near this place that had transformed him, had never seriously occurred to him. If I stay, he asked carefully, what would that look like? What would I do? That would be for you to discover, the chief replied. You would not live in our main village. That would cause too much pain for those who loved Nayati. But there are other places, smaller camps where the old ones live, where those who don't fit elsewhere find their home. You could live there, could learn more of our ways, could serve as, I don't know the English word, someone who helps people understand each other when they speak different languages of the heart, not just of the mouth. A mediator, Jacob said softly. A peacemaker. Yes, the chief said. This, if you choose it, but know that it will not be easy. Some of our young warriors see you as a symbol of white man's violence and ignorance. They will test you, will try to drive you away. And the white settlers who come increasingly to our lands will see you as a traitor, as someone who has gone native and betrayed his own people. You will belong fully to neither world." "I already don't belong to either world," Jacob said. "The man I was before died here, at this stone. What's been born to replace him doesn't fit anywhere I can think of. Maybe that's exactly what makes me right for the role you're describing. I have nothing to prove to anyone anymore. No identity to defend. No tribe to champion above all others. I just have this. The understanding I've gained. The knowledge of what violence costs. The desperate hope that maybe, somehow, I can prevent others from making the mistakes I made." Elder Nasha spoke again, at length this time, his voice strong despite his apparent age. Kuruk translated, "The elder says that Nayati would have wanted this. He says that his grandson, for Nayati was his grandson, believed that the only way forward was for our peoples to learn from each other, to see each other as human beings, rather than as threats or obstacles. He says that if your transformation is real, if your remorse is genuine, then perhaps Nayati's death can lead to something other than just more hatred and more death. He says he will sponsor you, will speak for you to those who doubt, will help you find your place if you choose to stay." Tears streamed down Jacob's face. To be offered not just mercy, but purpose, not just survival, but meaning. It was more than he dared hope for. "I will stay," he said, his voice breaking. "I will dedicate whatever years remain to me to the work of understanding, of peace, of honoring Nayati's vision. I swear it before the stone, before the spirits, before all of you." The elders nodded, some with approval, some with reservation, but all with a sense of solemnity that marked the moment as important. Chief Nantaje stepped forward and placed his hand on the stone, near Jacob's heart. "In 25 days you will be freed. Until then, use this time to prepare yourself. Reflect on everything you have learned. Make your peace with the man you were and the man you have become. And when you step away from this stone, step forward into your new life with full commitment, with no looking back." After they left, Jacob stood in the silence, feeling the significance of what had just occurred. He had been given a gift, not forgiveness perhaps, but something almost more valuable. A chance to make meaning from tragedy, to transform his greatest failure into something that might serve others. The final 25 days passed both quickly and slowly. Quickly, because Jacob knew that every sunrise brought him closer to freedom, to the end of this ordeal that had defined nearly 2 years of his life. Slowly, because now that the end was in sight, every moment seemed precious in a way it hadn't before. He would never stand at this stone again. He would never experience this particular quality of silence, this specific intersection of suffering and enlightenment. He found himself memorizing details he'd previously taken for granted. The exact shade of red the canyon walls turned at sunset. The pattern of stars that appeared each night, rotating slowly with the seasons. The sound of water dripping in the hidden places of the canyon, that steady rhythm that had marked time more reliably than any clock. On day 790, Kuruk came alone, without the usual supplies. "I wanted to speak with you before the ceremony," he said, as one man to another, without the formality of the council or the chief's presence. "I'm listening," Jacob said. Kuruk sat down on a rock near the pillar, unusual informality for the usually reserved warrior. "Nayati was my cousin. We grew up together, hunted together, shared the dreams and fears that young men share. When you killed him, I wanted to kill you. I volunteered to be the one to put a bullet in your head slowly, so you would feel it the way he felt your bullet." Jacob nodded, accepting this without defense. "You would have been justified." Chief Nantaje said no. He said that killing you would just create more killing, more grief, more emptiness. He said my son would want something different, something that might actually change things rather than just satisfying our need for revenge. I thought he was wrong. I thought he was weak, that grief had made him soft. Kuruk paused, picking up a small stone and turning it over in his hands. "But I have watched you these past months. I have seen you suffer, yes, but more than that, I have seen you change. The man who killed Nayati could never have survived what you've endured. That man would have broken in the first week, would have begged and screamed and lost his mind. "You are not that man anymore." "No," Jacob agreed quietly. "I'm not." "So I want you to know," Kuruk continued, his voice thick with emotion, "that while I will never forget what you did, while part of me will always hate you for it, another part of me respects what you have become. And if you truly dedicate yourself to the path Chief Nantaje has offered you, if you really work to prevent others from making your mistake, then perhaps my cousin's death will have served a purpose. And that is something I can live with." He stood up, preparing to leave, but Jacob called out to him, "Kuruk, thank you for telling me this, for seeing me as more than just the worst thing I've ever done. I will not let you down. I will not let Nayati down." The young warrior nodded once, then walked away, leaving Jacob alone with thoughts that swirled like leaves in the wind. On day 798, the warriors came to give him his final provisions before the release ceremony. They brought more food than usual, and fresh water to wash with, and the new clothes that had been prepared for him. But they did not help him put the clothes on, did not clean him, or tend to him. "Tomorrow you do these things yourself," one of them explained. "Today you are still bound. Tomorrow you are free." That night Jacob did not sleep. He stood at the stone, feeling its presence behind him, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. He thought about the young man he'd been, so certain of his own righteousness, so quick to fear and judge. He thought about Nayati, lying dead in the dust. He thought about Chief Nantaji's grief and his wife's death, and all the ripples of pain that spread out from his single moment of violence. But he also thought about what he'd learned, about the transformation that suffering and time had worked in him. He thought about the visions he'd experienced, the understanding he'd gained, the way his perception of the world had fundamentally shifted. He thought about the opportunity he'd been given, not just to survive, but to serve, to make meaning from tragedy. As dawn broke on day 800, Jacob heard the sound of many horses approaching. This was not the usual small group of warriors, but something larger, more significant. Through the canyon passage came a procession, Chief Nantaje at the front, followed by the Council of Elders, then many other members of the tribe. They filed into the chamber silently, arranging themselves in a large circle around the pillar, leaving one gap facing east toward the rising sun. Chief Nantaje dismounted and walked slowly to the pillar. In his hands he carried a large key, ornate and clearly ceremonial, made of what looked like silver and bone. "Jacob Mercer," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the canyon. "You have stood at the sacred stone for 800 days. You have endured heat and cold, hunger and thirst, pain and isolation. You have faced what you did, have understood its weight, have been transformed by that understanding. The sentence is complete. The debt is paid." He inserted the key into the first lock, one that secured the chains around Jacob's chest. It opened with a click that echoed off the stone walls. "As I remove these chains," the chief continued, "I do not remove your guilt or your responsibility, those you carry forever. But I remove the physical symbol of your punishment, acknowledging that you have fulfilled the terms of our justice." One by one, the locks opened. The chains fell away, clattering to the ground with a sound like bells. Jacob felt each one release as a shock to his system. His body had adapted so completely to their weight and restriction that their absence felt strange, almost wrong. When the final chain fell away, Jacob stood unsupported for the first time in 800 days. His legs trembled violently, and he would have collapsed if two warriors hadn't stepped forward to steady him. Every muscle in his body screamed. His joints felt frozen in place. But he was free. "Take 5 steps forward," Chief Nantaje instructed. "Away from the stone, into your new life." It was the hardest thing Jacob had ever done. His body had forgotten how to walk, forgotten how to balance without the chains and the stone. The first step nearly toppled him. The second was a little easier. By the 5th step, he'd reached the center of the circle, standing on his own, swaying but upright. The tribe began to chant, a low rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Elder Nasha stepped forward and marked Jacob's forehead with a paste made from red clay and sacred herbs. "You are no longer the man who killed Nayati," he said in Apache with Kuruk translating. "That man died at the stone. You are reborn, but you carry the memory of who you were and what you did. This mark shows that you have passed through death and returned, that you have been to the place between worlds and come back changed. Wear it with humility and with purpose." Other members of the tribe came forward, each offering something: a blanket woven with traditional patterns, a pair of moccasins, soft and perfectly fitted, a leather pouch containing herbs and medicines, a knife in a beaded sheath. Each gift was given silently, with a brief touch to his shoulder or arm, acknowledgement if not quite acceptance. When the gift-giving was complete, Chief Nantaje spoke again. "You have chosen to stay among us, to serve as a bridge between our world and the one you came from. This path will be difficult. You will be trusted by neither side completely. You will be tested constantly. But Elder Nasha has agreed to be your teacher, to help you understand our ways more deeply, and I have arranged for you to live in a small cabin near his camp, far enough from the main village that those who cannot bear to see you will not have to, but close enough that you can learn and serve as needed." Jacob tried to speak, but his voice failed him. His throat, unused to talking for days at a time, could barely form words. He cleared it painfully and tried again. "Thank you. I will honor this gift. I will dedicate my life to the work you've given me." The chief nodded. "There is one more thing." He turned and gestured, and from the back of the crowd, a young woman stepped forward. She was perhaps 20, with the same high cheekbones and proud bearing that Nayati had possessed. In her hands she carried something wrapped in soft deerskin. "This is Ashki, Nayati's younger sister," the chief said. "She has something to give you." Ashki approached Jacob slowly, her eyes locked on his face. When she stood before him, he could see that she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen, but her voice was steady when she spoke in English. "My brother believed in peace between our peoples. He believed in forgiveness and second chances. He believed that people could change." She paused, swallowing hard. "I do not know if I share his beliefs. I do not know if I can ever forgive you for taking him from us, but I know that he would want you to have this." She unwrapped the deerskin, revealing a beautifully carved wooden flute. "Nayati made this. He was going to use it in his manhood ceremony, the ceremony he never got to have because you killed him. Our mother kept it after he died, played it sometimes when her grief was too much to bear. Before she died, she told me to give it to you when you were released, if you survived. She said that if you could endure 800 days at the stone, then perhaps you had learned what Nayati wanted all white men to learn. She said you should have his flute, should play it, should let his music continue in the world, even though he is gone." Jacob took the flute with shaking hands. It was light, carved from some pale wood he didn't recognize, decorated with symbols that seemed to dance in the morning light. "I don't know how to play," he whispered. "Then you will learn," Ashki said. "My brother's music teacher still lives. He is old, but he can teach you. And when you learn to play, when you can make beautiful sounds with my brother's flute, then perhaps you will understand something more about what you took from the world." She turned and walked away, her back rigid with suppressed emotion. Jacob clutched the flute to his chest, feeling its weight, so light physically, so impossibly heavy symbolically. The ceremony concluded with more chanting, and then the tribe began to disperse. Warriors helped Jacob onto a horse, the first time he'd ridden in 800 days, and supported him as they made the journey to Elder Nasha's camp. Every movement was agony. His body, reshaped by standing for so long, protested violently against the new positions riding required. But Jacob endured it without complaint, knowing that this pain was temporary, that his body would adapt as it had adapted to everything else. Elder Nasha's camp was in a valley surrounded by cottonwood trees, with a small stream running through it. The cabin they'd prepared for Jacob was simple but sturdy, with a bed, a table, a stove for cooking and heating. After months of having nothing, it seemed impossibly luxurious. The elder helped him inside and settled him on the bed. "Rest now," he said in Apache, gesturing for Jacob to lie down. "Your body needs time to remember how to be free. Tomorrow, we begin your real education." Jacob lay down, the first time he'd been horizontal in 800 days, and felt his body relax in ways he'd forgotten were possible. But sleep didn't come easily. His mind raced with everything that had happened, everything that lay ahead. He was free, yes, but he was also bound more tightly than ever to this place, to these people, to the memory of Nayati and the promise he'd made to honor that memory. As night fell, Jacob took out the flute and held it, examining the carvings in the lamplight. He brought it to his lips and blew gently, producing a weak, uncertain note that seemed to die almost before it began. He tried again, and slowly, painfully, he began to coax sounds from the instrument. They were terrible sounds, amateurish and discordant, but they were sounds nonetheless, the first music this flute had made since Nayati's death. And as Jacob practiced through the night, learning through trial and error how to make the instrument respond to his breath, he felt something shift inside him. This was his new purpose. This was his path forward, not just to play the flute, but to keep Nayati's spirit alive in the world, to embody the principles of peace and understanding that the young man had believed in. The days that followed were a blur of learning and adjustment. Elder Nasha proved to be a patient but demanding teacher. He taught Jacob the Apache language properly, not just the handful of phrases he'd picked up during his imprisonment. He taught him the tribe's history, the complex system of clans and relationships, the spiritual beliefs that governed their worldview. He taught him about the plants and animals of the region, about how to read the weather and the landscape, about survival skills that went far beyond what Jacob had learned as a prospector. But more than practical knowledge, the elder taught wisdom. He told stories, long, elaborate tales that seemed to have no point until suddenly, unexpectedly, they revealed profound truths about human nature and the world. He asked questions that had no easy answers, forcing Jacob to think deeply about his beliefs and assumptions. He created situations where Jacob had to make difficult choices, then discuss those choices without judgment, helping him understand the implications of each decision. And every evening, Jacob practiced the flute. At first, the sounds he produced were painful to hear, but gradually, with instruction from the old music teacher Ashki had mentioned, he began to improve. Notes became melodies, melodies became songs. After 3 months, he played his first complete piece, one of Nayati's own compositions, taught to him by the music teacher who remembered every song his most talented student had ever created. Word of Jacob's presence spread through the territory. Some white settlers came to see him, curious about the man who'd survived 800 days at the Apache sacred stone. Some were sympathetic, understanding what he'd been through. Others were hostile, calling him a traitor and a savage lover. Jacob received both reactions with equanimity, trying to explain his perspective to those who would listen, accepting the hatred of those who wouldn't. He also began to serve as a mediator in small disputes between Apache and white settlers. A stolen horse here, a boundary disagreement there, a misunderstanding over water rights. Nothing major, but important to the people involved. Jacob found that his unique position, trusted fully by neither side but understood by both, allowed him to see perspectives that others missed. He could explain to settlers why the Apache reacted as they did to certain violations of their customs. He could explain to Apache why white settlers behaved in ways that seemed inexplicable or offensive. More importantly, he could speak from experience about the cost of fear-driven violence. When young Apache warriors talked about raiding white settlements, Jacob would tell them about Nayati, about the 800 days at the stone, about how one moment of fear-driven violence had cascaded into years of suffering for everyone involved. When white settlers talked about shooting any Apache on sight, he would describe Chief Nantage's grief, his wife's death, the ripples of pain that spread through an entire community when one person was killed. Some listened, many didn't. But slowly, gradually, Jacob began to make a difference. Conflicts that might have escalated into violence were resolved through dialogue. Young men on both sides who might have killed each other were brought together to talk, to see each other as human beings rather than as threats. 1 year after his release, on the anniversary of his freedom, Jacob returned to Iron Canyon. He'd asked permission from Chief Nantage, who had granted it with a nod of understanding. "The stone calls to you," the chief had said. "It always will. Go. Pay your respects." Jacob made the journey alone, riding the horse that had been gifted to him, carrying Nayati's flute. When he entered the canyon and saw the pillar standing there, exactly as it had been, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that he was no longer chained to it. Gratitude for what it had taught him. Something almost like affection for this piece of stone that had been his companion through the most transformative period of his life. He approached the pillar and placed his hand on it, feeling its warmth in the afternoon sun. "Thank you," he said aloud, "for not killing me, for teaching me, for transforming me into someone who might actually do some good in the world." Then he sat down with his back against the stone, freely this time by choice rather than compulsion. And he played the flute. He played the songs Nayati had composed, letting the music echo off the canyon walls, filling the sacred space with beauty. He played for hours until the sun set and the stars emerged overhead. Those same stars he'd watched for 800 nights. When he finally left the canyon, he felt a sense of completion. He would return periodically, he knew, but he didn't belong here anymore. He belonged in the world, doing the work he'd committed to, living the life he'd been given a second chance to live. As years passed, Jacob became a fixture in the region, the white man who lived with the Apache, the bridge between worlds, the living reminder of the cost of violence and the possibility of transformation. His hair turned gray, then white. His body, reshaped by 800 days at the stone, never quite returned to normal. He walked with a slight stoop, and his legs sometimes ached on cold nights, but he endured these minor discomforts without complaint. He never married, never had children of his own. His family was the Apache community that had adopted him, and his legacy was the countless small acts of peace and understanding he facilitated. He became known as a storyteller, traveling between settlements and Apache camps, sharing his story and the lessons he'd learned. Children would gather around him to hear about the sacred stone, about the transformation that suffering could work, about the importance of seeing others as fully human. On his deathbed, 30 years after his release from the stone, Jacob was surrounded by Apache friends and the few white settlers who had come to respect him. Kuruk was there, now a chief himself, along with Ashki, whose own children had grown up knowing Jacob as a beloved uncle figure. Chief Nantage had died years before, but his legacy lived on in the peace his unusual justice had helped create. Jacob's last words were in Apache, a prayer of thanks to the stone, to Nayati's spirit, to all those who had given him a chance to become something better than what he'd been. And as he died, Ashki played Nayati's flute, the same flute Jacob had learned to play, the same flute that had come to symbolize the possibility of redemption and transformation. The story of Jacob Mercer and the 800 days at the sacred stone became legend in the region, passed down through generations of both Apache and white settlers. Some versions emphasized the suffering, turning it into a cautionary tale about respecting native boundaries and customs. Other versions emphasized the transformation, using it to illustrate the possibility of change and redemption even after the worst mistakes. But those who had known Jacob personally, who had witnessed his journey from killer to peacemaker, knew that the real power of the story lay in its complexity. It wasn't just about punishment or redemption, suffering or transformation. It was about all of these things at once, about how human beings can contain multiple truths simultaneously, that we can be both destroyer and builder, both broken and whole, both guilty and redeemed. The stone still stands in Iron Canyon, weathered by wind and time but eternal in its patience. Those who know its history approach it with reverence, understanding that it represents something profound about justice, suffering, and the possibility of change. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of dusk or dawn, those with sensitive ears claim they can hear the faint sound of a flute playing in the canyon. Whether it's the wind moving through the rocks or something else entirely, no one can say for certain. Thank you so much for watching this incredible journey of transformation and redemption. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear this powerful message about the consequences of our actions and the possibility of change. Your support helps us bring more amazing stories like this to life. Until next time, remember that every choice we make has weight, and it's never too late to become someone better than who we were yesterday.